Now I gotta say this up front because what we're gonna talk about today seems like just utter madness, just futility. But there's something you need to understand about this war is this is really the first war where we have industrialized powers all facing off against each other. Industry has changed the world at such a level and such a pace that the commanders who are in charge of this have not yet really grasped the change in the world. These men that are in charge of making decisions have gone to war colleges all over Europe, some of the best war colleges on earth. And what they learned when they were younger is the future of warfare on land is cavalry. They thought that the future was going to be fought on horseback. Can you imagine being taught when you're in college, horses are the wave of military future, and then you're thrown into this? Are horses going to do you any good in this scenario? Not really. These guys are literally learning how to fight this war as it's taking place. Now, I will tell you this because this happened a few years ago. I use this phrase, and I'm going to use it again. These commanders are going to have to learn how to fight this war with a huge learning curve. In doing so, it's going to cost millions and millions of lives. I had a girl years ago, she's like, that's very insensitive. I'm like, I don't care. That's the truth. This is how they have to learn how to fight this war. And what they do is simply just madness. The choices they make are just so blatantly false. We got to talk about the tactics that they use fighting in these trenches. Now, keep in mind, as I showed you guys yesterday, when these trenches are first created, they're really simplistic. I showed you that picture yesterday. They're basically like 7 feet deep. They're just as wide as a man. As the war's dragging on, these trenches get considerably more elaborate and considerably more sophisticated. So I want to show you this 3D image here. And I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'll explain it. This right here represents the front line of the trenches. Now, when I showed you guys that picture a couple days ago, there was just one big long trench. As time goes on and they get more sophisticated, they dig behind the front line a secondary trench. Now, it has multiple reasons. It's support, it's going to be storage, it has a lot of different purposes behind it. Then again, they dig a third trench. This tertiary trench, again, has other purposes. It's support, it's communication, etc. Now, there are also going to be these connecting trenches right here. So what was once just one big long line is now a huge network of trenches. Now I know it's kind of hard to see, but are we okay on this conceptually? Okay. Now, if this is the front line right here, it's often protected by just rows of barbed wire. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever actually been stuck in barbed wire, but it tends to just kind of grab. If you get stuck in it, it's actually really hard to get out. It's almost like a net, really. This is designed to protect the front line of the trenches from an infantry attack. Now, we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But stationed behind the trenches is often going to be these gigantic pieces of artillery, the big Berthas that I showed you guys. Now, they have their purpose, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment here. The commanders that are making choices on how they're going to attack are working with a really wide learning curve. Like I say, these guys were trained as young officers that horses were the wave of the future. Now they're in a scenario where you have airplanes and zeppelins and you have huge artillery pieces. What they were taught is not even close to what the world is today. The attacks they come up with are absolutely futile. They're worthless. They just slaughter people. And both sides are going to come up with the same idea. Phase 1 is going to be launch the artillery. These gigantic shells, and I'll show you some examples of this here in just a little bit. fire this artillery over your trench and hit the enemy's trench with the idea that you're going to, what they say, quote, soften up resistance before sending in the infantry, the men on foot. Now, the idea behind this is they want to hit the enemy trench so hard and with so much artillery that everyone in the enemy trench is dead before you even actually arrive there, or before the infantry actually arrives. What one of these British commanders believed is, we're going to use our artillery as almost like a steel force field, is what he said. What he believed, and I will say this, it's not that far off, but I wish someone would have said, that's a really foolish idea. What he wants to do is launch this artillery over his trench and just drop it right in front of his troops going forward. This is his force field of steel, where this artillery will protect his men from the onslaught of the other trench. Now, before I kind of move on, are we okay with this idea of launching artillery just like right in front of his men as they keep going? You see what I mean? Yeah. This is where things go awry. You have to time it all but perfectly to drop this artillery just in front of your men as they advance forward. Now let me ask you, do you guys see a potential problem with this? What happens if your timing is off just a little bit? You're dropping it on your own men. The first time he tried to do this, he killed about 50,000 of his own men. And after that he said, my timing was off. Let's try again. Do we see an issue here? This is a problem where these guys are learning as they go, and it costs thousands upon millions of lives in the process. Now, this is just a picture, or a handful of pictures, about what kind of artillery we'll deal with. Now, this right here is a standard shell. This is pretty normal. This is a 500-pound shell. This is basically the one that fits in Big Bertha. This right here is the aftermath of just one of these artillery barrages. These are just all spent shells that they used trying to hit the enemy trench before the infantry. This right here represents a barrage of about 2 hours. That's pretty small, actually. Some of these artillery barrages are going to last for days or weeks, or the record, a 3-month straight artillery barrage, just one shell after another for 3 months. Now, like I said, this one's pretty small, and look at all the shells they used. Now, as the war progresses and they start thinking bigger, this is going to be the biggest artillery piece in the world. This right here will shatter records. Now, I know it's kind of hard to conceptualize how big this is. This contraption right here is about twice the size of a railroad car. It's so big, the only way to move it is to literally build a railroad and then build this on top of it. This thing is so huge that it could launch a shell that's about the size of, give or take, it's about the size of like a Ford Expedition. Launch a shell that big, 200 miles. It goes so high in the air, it touches the upper atmosphere and then comes down. The guy who fired this, he's actually a German, he said, I think we just fired on God. That's the size and the size and the power we're talking about here. Now that's phase 1. Once the artillery is completed, it's time for phase 2. Phase 2 is now you send in the infantry. You send in the foot soldiers. Now, like I was saying, the idea behind the artillery was, we're going to hit the enemy trench so hard with so much artillery, no one's going to even be alive when you get there. Well, these trenches are so defendable that you can just simply really dig deeper and there are countless number of these, where you can dig about 20 feet underground into foxholes. So when the artillery comes, you just fall back into the foxhole, wait for the artillery barrage to be over, and once you hear it end, you know that the soldiers are coming. When you hear the artillery barrage end, you get out of the foxhole, get back to the surface of the trench, set up the machine guns, and then you wait. As soon as you see the enemy coming towards you, you just mow them down with machine guns. Now, I need to just say this. Does anyone see a problem with that too? These machine gunners talk about how when the war was first starting, they said, I feel kind of guilty about this. I feel like this isn't even war. It's just slaughter. They didn't even have to aim. They just spray across the battlefield. And when you're out of bullets, you reload and just spray some more. Now, I was telling you guys a couple days ago about some of those stories where that one commander had a bucket of all the valuables of his men and said, whoever comes back gets the valuables. The odds of making it back are really against. A lot of times, just no one made it back. They just got mowed down and slaughtered and left in what's called no man's land. Now, I do want to show you this real fast because this right here is actually an aerial picture of the two systems of trenches. This right here is the front line of a British trench. This is secondary, this is tertiary, this is the connecting communication lines. This right here is actually the German line. So they have the front line here, secondary, tertiary. In the middle here is what's called no man's land. It's filled with craters and bodies and body parts and barbed wire and poison gas. This is apocalyptic. Now, I want to ask you guys, but it's kind of old at this point. Did you guys ever see the Lord of the Rings movies? Maybe. Yeah, I know they're kind of old now, but the author of those books was in the trenches in World War I. So what they show in the movies as, I forget, the Black Castle, I forget what it is. I think it starts with an M or an N. I don't remember it now. But it's just filled with smoke and fire and destruction. That's what he wrote about what he saw in no man's land. It's hell on earth. There's this story, well, there are multiple stories, about this one British soldier who was trying to get back to his trench, made it to probably about right there. He was about 50 yards from his trench when he got hit with an artillery barrage and it blew his leg off. So he's in no man's land, yelling to his friends to come get him. And they just said, we're not going out there. We're not going to get you. We'll get picked off by a sniper. We'll get hit with artillery. We're staying right here. So they just listened to him scream in pain for 2 days before he died. Now that's one of just countless stories of what happens during this. These attacks are just useless. It's just slaughter for 4 years. It claims an entire generation of young men as the only thing these commanders can think to do is just send more numbers. Now, I was telling you guys before, for the first time in human history, we have these huge empires that have massive numbers of people, big populations, and they can all take a punch. Every one of these empires has millions upon millions of people, and losing huge numbers can be replaced. And each side believes if we're taking casualties like this, the other side has to be